I'm fortunate enough to be asked to be the MC for this event this afternoon. So thank you for attending. There will be 3 speakers today. There'll be 2 people speaking individually. The first will be Ms. Rebecca Hall, who's the Commissioner for Victoria for Southeast Asia. The second is Chow Ta, who's the Executive Director for SC Capital Partners Group and is also President of the Australian ASEAN Chamber of Commerce. And thirdly, we'll have Gary Embleton, who's a long-time expert in international trade, who's the Operations Director for AusFine Foods International. So I believe it's Rebecca who will be speaking first. Before we start, there's a couple of housekeeping. We have any questions, please put them in the Q&A chat box at the bottom, and we'll be sharing that at the end of the presentations, where the 3 panelists will be happy to answer any questions within reason. And also, just as you will have noted, this presentation is being recorded, and we're hoping to make that available after the event has been concluded. So on that note, I will hand over to Rebecca. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ashley, for the introduction, and great to be part of today's conversation, unpacking the Australian Business in ASEAN Survey from 2021. Delighted to be joined here with Gary, Chow, and of course yourself, Ashley, because this is, I think, a very important conversation, and one that we at Global Victoria are keen to take the learnings and the insights from this survey, but also to add our specific perspective from the team on the ground, and also with our other partner chambers in the region. So firstly, just a little bit about myself, about Global Victoria, and what we're hoping to achieve from this conversation before Chow takes us through the detailed report. So I actually started this role in September last year as Victoria's Commissioner to Southeast Asia at a time when we certainly understood the impacts of COVID, or we thought we understood the significant impacts of COVID. And I was very excited to take on a role leading our 4 offices in Southeast Asia, so in Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, but also more broadly our work across ASEAN, and we add to that Timor-Leste as well. So I think it's an understatement to say there's never been a more important time for us to navigate through complex trade, investment, and geopolitical business engagements. And it's an absolute pleasure to be leading this work on behalf of the Victorian Government, but importantly to be partnering with our bilateral chambers and business chambers in the region. I want to pay credit to the board members, the volunteers, those that pulled together this insight from Austcham ASEAN. I think it's a fantastic resource, the survey, but also the work that you do collectively to bring the voice of our bilateral chambers in the region. During COVID, we as Global Victoria have extended our reach and partnership with all of the chambers in the region, and also great to have Gary here from his work with the Australia-Indonesia Business Council, and recently becoming the chair of that group in Victoria as well. So part of this conversation, as I said at the outset, is learning from not just what we've seen in the survey, but also from the on-the-ground perspectives. I'll be sharing with you what our team on the ground, our team of trade advisors, investment specialists and education partners are seeing and working on. But also, I think in the questions that we get from the audience and in the direction that we get from you, shaping where we should be putting our priorities and our efforts moving forward as well. I think I'll leave it there because I'm really conscious to get into the detail of the presentation today, and very happy to be involved in the question and answers at the end, along with the other panel members. So back to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I will run through your biography before we start the panel, so I apologise for not doing that initially. The next speaker is going to be Chow Ta. Chow is the Executive Director for legal transactions for the SC Capital Partners Group, a funds management group managing RECAP opportunistic funds investing in real estate. She leads the legal team on all transactions for SC Capital Pan Asia, including Asia and Vietnam. Chow has also served as a board director of the Australian Chamber of Commerce for Vietnam, Austcham Vietnam, for 10 years between 2012 and 21. She was the chairwoman for Austcham Vietnam in 2017-2018, and she is also a foundation member of the Australian Chamber of Commerce ASEAN, Austcham ASEAN, serving as its vice chair in 2019. She's been serving as chair through 2020 and for the current year, 2021. She is Australian raised. She's a trained, educated lawyer holding a BA and Bachelor of Law honours and Masters of International Law from the University of Sydney. And she's married to a Vietnamese husband with 3 children and happily settled in Ho Chi Minh City. So on that, I'll pass over to Chow.
Thank you, Ashley. I've never had my bio all fully communicated to everybody, so thank you for that. Very pleased to be here. I'm here to present the results of our Austcham ASEAN survey, and then with the panel to discuss further in specifics of the 4 countries that we're going to be focusing on. So I'm going to share screen now. Okay, so good afternoon from Ho Chi Minh City, a very sunny day today, and we're about to go out of hard lockdown. So very looking forward to seeing all of you in person in the near future. As many of you know or are aware that Austcham ASEAN carries out an annual Australian Business in ASEAN survey. 2021 is our 6th annual business survey, and the results were released earlier this month. First, I'd like to thank the Australia ASEAN Council for supporting us in the surveys throughout, and also to thank the Victorian Government for this opportunity to co-chair the event and to share our findings. So, as I said, to set the mood for our panel discussion later, I'm pleased to present to you some of the very high-level results drawn from the unparalleled competitive data. So, as to the profiles of Australian business in ASEAN. Australian business in ASEAN comes in all shapes and sizes. As you can see from the graph, the table there, 38% of firms reported less than 1 million in revenue over the previous 12 months. 37% of them reported a workforce of 10 or less. But to note that 20% of firms undertaking this survey has a workforce of more than 200 employees. Respondents operate across similar spread of sectors recorded in the Austcham ASEAN 2020 survey. So as you can see, service firms continues to dominate the Australian business community in ASEAN, leading by professional services of 22% of respondents, closely followed by financial services, education and training, and travel and hospitality and entertainment. Near to 2/3 of Australian business in ASEAN are multinationals, and you can see the breakdown there. We'll get into that. And a significant portion of Australian business in ASEAN are long established, of 28% of respondents commencing operations 10 years or more. But encouragingly, 26% of them have begun operations less than 2 years ago. So what are their views on ASEAN integration? Very briefly, 46% of respondents believe that ASEAN integration is integral for improving how business is conducted in the region. Respondents in Singapore, Laos, and Cambodia exhibits the most widespread belief of the importance of ASEAN integration. For the first time, nearly half of the respondents have a self-sufficient understanding of what ASEAN integration is all about and what it means for their business. By contrast, 23% claims to have no understanding and needing more information. Market access continues to be the most important benefit, though this response is now showing a clear downward trend. And of course, I think we all need to take COVID into consideration with these numbers. By contrast, improving the ease of export and importing, as well as reducing tariffs, are increasingly becoming more important expected benefits of ASEAN integration for Australian businesses across the region. In general, few respondents report actively using the 5 Australian free trade agreements available within the ASEAN 60% region. And of course, similar to last year, 50% of those continues to be the widespread use is the ANSFTA. 19% of respondents reporting that they have made use of it. So what are they thinking about expansion in ASEAN. A typical Australian business operates in 2 to 3 ASEAN national markets. However, in comparison to last year's survey, the average Australian business is operating in fewer ASEAN markets, declining from an average of 2.9 markets to now 2.4. The largest proportional declines are seen in Laos and Indonesia. Similarly, Australian business are planning to expand in fewer ASEAN markets than compared to 2020. On average, respondents are planning to expand into 1.15 new markets per firm. This is a decline of 15% from 2020 numbers. A notable exception though, given the size of its market, it's the Philippines. 14% of Australian businesses surveyed plan to expand into the Filipino market. That's a 26% improvement to the 2020 numbers. Promisingly, 44% of respondents reported increased trade and investment over the 2-year period since 2019, highlighting the potential buffering effects of the ASEAN economic dynamism offers to Australian businesses as the region economies recovers. ASEAN's growing consumer class remains to be the dominant reason for expanding into ASEAN, followed by infrastructure improvements and continued regional integration. While last year has clearly been challenging and the last 2 years, optimism about future growth is quite promising, with 81% of firms expecting revenue growth in the years ahead, similar to 2019 figures of 82%. Respondents nominated barriers to ownership and investments as operational frustrations of operating in ASEAN, then followed by corruption and inefficiency of import-export procedures. So to this last part of my reporting to you is we're going to go with the overall theme that we've taken from this year's result is around seeing opportunities in recovery, and then wrapping up focusing on those 4 countries, Cambodia, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. So overall, 27% of respondents reported revenue growth since COVID-19, whereas 52% reported revenue deterioration. Laos, followed by Vietnam, and the Philippines experienced the largest revenue growth. Indonesia, at 73%, followed by Cambodia and Thailand, experienced the greatest revenue deterioration. Travel, hospitality, and entertainment firms suffered the greatest decline, with revenues, 75% of those reported revenues deterioration of more than 40%. Between 60 and 70% of firms in education, transport, healthcare, and agriculture suffered declining revenues as well. But it wasn't all bad news. Firms in environmental services, consumer goods, and media and communication generally reported increase in revenue, perhaps highlighting the capturing shifts of expenditure caused by the pandemic response. The closures of Australian international borders has led to a variety of negative consequences for Australian businesses in ASEAN. Respondents reporting reduce in trade and deals transactions, as well as dampening of their sense of connectedness to Australian operations are the reasons or the cause or the sentiments that they feel from border closures. But interestingly, 26% of respondents felt no impact. The sudden arrival of COVID-19 in early 2020 threatened significant disruptions for Australian businesses across ASEAN. A year on, 40% of respondents believe their firm's operations has performed better than expected. This is particularly true for Singapore, with 58% better than expected, followed by Myanmar and then Laos. Performing worse than expectations were Indonesia at 45%, and then Thailand, Malaysia. When asked how their firm's operations adapted with COVID-19 induced changes, 55% of respondents are now operating with minimal business impact, while of course the 45% are still catching up and trying to cope with the change. Australian businesses in Indonesia reported the worst disruption in ASEAN. Since COVID, the ASEAN economic business community has struggled most with the sudden decrease in demands for goods and services and increase in logistical challenges. Regulatory uncertainty about lifting of trade restrictions, for example, lockdowns, are also a part of their concerns. While COVID presents a major challenges for business across the region, it also represents opportunities. As you can see there, people can attest to it: more efficient working, virtual working practice, greater staff productivities and flexibility. And of course, I think this depends on which sector we're talking about. When asked to identify up to 3 non-tariff measures that affect or impact their ease of trade and investment, 63% of members find that trade and investments are frustrated by NTMs. Export-related controls, intellectual property measures, and distribution restrictions topping the list. Just to touch on this point, over the last few years, we've heard a variety of stories about how China's rising tension with its foreign relations might shift trade and investments towards our Southeast Asian region. When asked of our members, they shared mixed and uncertain views. As you can see there, 11% of respondents noticed a positive impact, while another 18% is expecting a positive impact. But of course, on the converse to this, 10% of firms have already noticed negative impacts, and another 26 expecting negative impacts in the future. So, country-specific insights. How does Cambodia compares? Firms in Cambodia generally report a stable profit. Only a small proportion reported growing profitability of 20%. The size of customer base and access to skilled labor was the biggest challenge of operating in Cambodia for 40% of respondents. Note that access to skilled labor declined by 35% from a 75% recorded in 2020 survey as an operational challenge. Weak law enforcement and also personal security were other key challenges. Onto Indonesia. Firms in Indonesia generally reported deteriorating profits, as mentioned earlier for the last 12 months, with 77% experiencing declines in profitability. Government bureaucracies continues to dominate the most substantial barrier of doing business in the country. Weak law enforcement and corruptions have moved up to second and third highest barriers, and then traffic and congestions and unfair business practice has gone down in priority. For the Philippines, we've mentioned some statistics earlier where the Philippines is experiencing an increase in interest in expansion. It continues to attract new investments from Australian business communities, with 30% having entered the market within the last 2 years. The top growth drivers for the Philippines over the last year were economic conditions of the country, followed by proximity to customers and ease of doing business. 40% of firms showed profitability growth of the last 12 months, with only 25% of firms reporting a decline. Government bureaucracies continues to be the highest impact business constraints for the majority of the respondents, while traffic congestions has less significant impact, slipping to become the second most cited business constraint. And finally, Vietnam. Business conditions over the last 12 months were mixed, with 44% of firms reporting improved profitability, while 32% reported decrease. And I think that also, again, the shifting of the types of business that are operating during COVID. Government bureaucracies is the most common identified high impact constraints in doing business in Vietnam, having grown significantly now, impacting upon 48% of firms compared to 10% in 2020. Tax system ranks equally second with corruption. And of course, I'm just extracting these information for the conversations to come. The full report is available, but if I can leave this picture here, you can see business challenges broken down country by country. The red boxes being the most fluently cited challenge, and then orange as a second, and then by yellow. The barriers to ownership and corruptions are the most common challenges in most nations. Time costs for importing and exporting are also common, followed by taxation. Indonesia and Philippines are the only two countries reported acute issues with skilled labor shortages. Infrastructure gaps are reported in Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, and quality and ease of banking are notable issues for Myanmar and Vietnam. Cost of operations appear to be an extreme issue for Myanmar. So on that note, and I think not leaving a really bad impression, but I think we should be talking about opportunities in those 4 countries. Back to you, Ashley.